All right, welcome everyone to our live conversation today with environmental philosopher Henry Dix. Henry's work has been known to us and to Janine for years, she's been watching it. And as we've been developing content throughout the years, the last several, almost 5 years that I've been here, we've crossed paths with Henry a few times, had great conversations every time, and really excited to bring those conversations to you and to bring the community into these conversations. Henry's work as an environmental philosopher is to look at our relationship to the environment from a philosophical standpoint, as you might imagine. And that brings really new light and new angles from which to view some of the things that we talk about all the time in biomimicry. And it also sheds light on some corners that we haven't explored much as practitioners, but that have a lot of really interesting things to bear on the conversation. And I think pathways that it shows to new applications and new ways of engaging with others in the community. So thanks everyone for being here today. Thank you, Henry, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So as we said, in the intro here and on the informational packets that we sent out around this, Henry's work really adds this philosophical dimension to biomimicry, but more importantly, it just looks at biomimicry from a philosophical standpoint. And one of the most interesting things to me, Henry, about this, as we've talked about this, is just that initial kernel of what is it about biomimicry that makes you say, amongst all of the environmental movements that we have, why does this one stand out as kind of standing up to philosophical engagement and thought?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that was exactly what drew me to biomimicry. So I came to environmental philosophy for two reasons. I was already into philosophy. I was studying that. And then I realized that the environment at one point was the question of the 21st century. It's the question of our generation, climate change, biodiversity, all that stuff. So I put the two together. And I also thought it was important to put the two together because from my point of view, particularly as a philosopher, though, as a human being, I can say this too, it is through philosophy that ultimately the environmental crisis at its deepest level can be addressed. There are superficial solutions, but your job as a philosopher is to think deeply about things, right? So thinking deeply about the environmental crisis is, I think, essential. And as I was doing my best to think deeply about the environmental crisis, I was trying to sort of give content to that idea. And I came across biomimicry and I realized that there was this profound philosophical aspect to it that, to my mind, neither biomimicry practitioners nor professional philosophers were fully aware of. I think in the biomimicry movement, there was an awareness that it was something really important. It had this kind of intuitive appeal to people, right? I mean, so many people, they encounter biomimicry, they read Benioff's book, they go to a talk and they're kind of hooked, right? And that's because it is deeply appealing to us. But it's also, it comes across as very original, right? We're kind of used to things not being biomimetic, not being inspired by nature. And so when someone gives you an example, you're like, wow, what a great idea. And this is also true of the philosophy, right? Philosophers are not really aware of this possibility of gaining knowledge from nature. So there's this huge branch of philosophy called epistemology. This is really the sort of core of philosophy, along with ontology and metaphysics. And, every single philosophy student in every single university in the world will study epistemology, but not a single one of them. So epistemology is the idea, it's the study of knowledge, right? The question of what knowledge is and where it comes from, basically. And not a single one of those students will have encountered the idea that we could get knowledge from nature, that we could learn from nature. I just think that's amazing that you've got, these really deep thinkers trying to come up with great original ideas. And yet you've got this little biomimicry movement that they haven't heard of that has had this incredible brainwave with all sorts of practical applications, and they're unaware of that. Yeah. So I'm trying to bring these two communities together. It's a challenge, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. So what are the things that people generally see as the source of knowledge? What are the other things that nature comes up with?
So the easiest way to explain this, well, there's kind of two ways of looking at this. One is via something that Janine Benyus said. So she said, up until now, we've basically been learning about nature. What we need to do is learn from nature. Okay. And that's how philosophers have seen the epistemological relationship to nature. Nature is something that we learn about, right? We study it and we gain knowledge about that. But that knowledge isn't coming from nature. Where's it coming from? It's coming from us as human beings. It's coming from the senses. It's coming from human reason, possibly intuition, other human beings, right? Social epistemology says, yeah, we can learn from other beings. It's not just by looking around. And the big kind of selling point of social epistemology has been to say that, in fact, most knowledge comes from other people, right? There's very little science, for example, that individual scientists have developed, right? Almost all of their knowledge comes from other scientists. A fascinating way of thinking about biomimicry is as an expansion of the epistemological community, right? So just as Aldo Leopold said, there's this ethical community that we've restricted to human beings, right? We care about one another. We need to expand it so that it encompasses what he called the land, right? So all living beings, but also, rivers, mountains, what have you. You can see biomimicry as an expansion of the epistemological community, such that humans aren't just sharing knowledge amongst themselves. They're also part of a community with nature, with a lot of knowledge potentially being transferred from nature to human beings.
Yeah, okay, that's great. You talked about that being explored maybe a little bit more in the ancient origins of philosophy, where there was kind of a sense that that nature was somehow the source of some of the things that we knew and did as humans, and that there was some kind of sense of connection or interplay there, but that this kind of looks at it a little bit differently.
Yeah, So I wrote this book, right? You may have heard of it. It's called The Biomimicry Revolution. So I took the expression from Bennius and kind of developed the sort of concept a bit. And what I argue in that book is that the biomimicry revolution that Bennius basically presented initially is also in some sense a revolution in that sense of kind of revolving back to something, i.e. to the origin of Western thought in the ancient Greeks. And fascinatingly, all of the major ancient Greek philosophers, it depends a little bit how you interpret someone like Plato, but certainly Democritus, the father of materialism and atomism, and Aristotle, Plato's disciple, they both saw technology as imitation of nature. And this was just a kind of almost common sense view among the ancient Greeks. They didn't develop the epistemological side of it as much. It's kind of implicit. Democritus said that we learn how to make swallows' nests by how to make houses by studying swallows' nests, right? And we learned how to weave by looking at spiders and so on. So there was this idea of learning, but they were still much more interested, as far as epistemology is concerned, in learning about nature, about the universe, about human beings, and so on. And they were interested in where technology came from, but they weren't interested in technological innovation, right? And if you look at our society today, there's an obsession, right, with technological innovation. It's what drives growth, progress, and so on. The Greeks didn't think like that at all. They just wanted to understand how things were. And so their interest in technology wasn't how can we learn from nature how to make more and more better stuff or solve environmental problems or anything like that. It was they were trying to answer the question, where does technology come from? And to them, it made complete sense that it came from nature because, they weren't aware of evolution, right? That concept wasn't discussed and sort of accepted as it is today. So they weren't quite sure what the origins of human beings were. But if you imagine the first human beings, okay, we don't really have technology. Where's that technology going to come from? If you're just a small group of human beings with trees and, fish and animals and insects and so on around you, where are you going to get your ideas from? You're going to get it from the world around you, right? And you're going to learn from the other species and systems around you, which also ties the origin of Western thought into indigenous thought, right? Because this is commonplace in indigenous thought. And in fact, the only epistemology in the world other than biomimetic epistemology where you find this idea is indigenous epistemology, right? You don't get it in feminist epistemology or any of the sort of recognized branches of contemporary Western epistemology.
Yeah, I love that connection. We had been kind of talking about this in terms of, Western philosophy, and there's Eastern philosophy, there's other philosophies, there's other cultures, there's all kinds of things. So when we really think about this as a story of exploring, humans and the way that we see ourselves in relationship to nature, we really need to think of that in the context of all humans and the ways that all cultures have done this, and these conversations that have been had and these influences have been had throughout the eons and in all of the different environments in the world. And I think there's often a sense that we have a real disconnection between that kind of modern industrial globalist approach and indigenous knowledge and indigenous approaches. So it's an interesting way to be able to trace some of that thought and go back. So it begs a question for me of like, if we can look back at the foundation of Western thought, and they're saying, well, obviously nature is where we get everything. How did we get to the point now where we're more like, well, nature is this thing to be conquered, and we're going to do everything much smarter than nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a German philosopher, quite a famous one, Hans Blumenberg, and he wrote an amazing essay called The Imitation of Nature in 1957, which coincidentally, I think, was the year that the term biomimetics was coined. But anyway, so he wrote this essay, and the subtitle is The Prehistory of the Created Being. And he traced the story of how we went from the ancient Greek view as man as imitating nature, right? This was Aristotle's view and so on. And that was then preserved throughout the Middle Ages. I mean, you were imitating God's creation because that was how nature was viewed at the time. And then it endured also in the Renaissance, right? Leonardo da Vinci, we see as a kind of forefather of biomimicry. But in fact, he was working within this long-standing tradition of seeing, nature as something to be imitated. And you get a massive shift. I think the kind of, personally, I differ slightly from Blumenberg. I won't bore you with the differences, but I think the Enlightenment changed a lot. This idea of humans as having sort of full autonomy, not depending on tradition, right? That, this almost, independence from nature could be a part of that. Hegel explicitly rejected the idea of art, and he included in the category of art technology, right? Because there wasn't this sharp divide 200 years ago between art and technology, or, craft and engineering. He completely rejected that idea, this idea that art imitated nature. And then you get the Industrial Revolution and the first philosophers of technology. So up until that point, technology wasn't really separated as an area of philosophical study. And then you suddenly get the philosophy of technology, loads of books called the philosophy of technology. And the common theme amongst those first philosophers of technology is that we've been wasting our time for 2,000 years trying to imitate nature. We should be doing the opposite. The best example of this is a German philosopher called Friedrich Dessauer, who wrote a book in 1927 called The Philosophy of Technology. And he said, human technology doesn't work like nature, and it shouldn't work like nature. He gave the example of a plane, right? The reason why we haven't made airplanes until the beginning of the 20th century is that we've been trying to copy birds with their flapping wings. Obviously, he's mistaken to this to a large extent, because, the people who first really did the pioneering work that set the ground for the airplane studied birds very carefully, right? Otto Lilienthal studied the flight of birds, published on that. So it's false. I mean, it's true that there were jet engines that were introduced rather than flapping wings to generate thrust. But anyway, there was this kind of take on technology as ideally not imitating nature. And what Dessauer said was that we kind of came across these technological ideas in a kind of separate world that only humans inhabited. And we came up with them based on using human reason in conjunction with knowledge of the laws of science. And by doing that, we would necessarily, he thought, come up with completely different solutions to nature. And what I find fascinating is that Janine Benyus says something similar. She says, well, the Industrial Revolution, it was all about taking materials and energy from nature, but the ideas for technologies came from us, right? And that's kind of the problem. We've just seen nature as a source of raw materials, right? Whereas we need to see it as a source of knowledge as well. but that was deliberately advocated at the time, right? So you can see a reflection of the underlying philosophy of the Industrial Revolution in the publications of philosophers. It wasn't some sort of coincidence, right? When people explain the Industrial Revolution, they say, oh no, it's just because, you know, people made a discovery and there were all these engineers and it's more complicated than that. There was this epistemological shift which said, let's not imitate nature anymore. And that, I think you could convincingly argue, is what made the Industrial Revolution possible. And what could kind of reverse it, or at least in its negative effects, is a certain kind of renewal of that ancient thought that you find in the Greeks and indigenous people, in Eastern thought as well. A colleague, Freya Matthews, an Australian environmental philosopher, has published a lot on the relationship between biomimicry and Taoism, right? I mean, it's all phrased quite differently from in Western philosophy. The concepts are very different, but there is more or less this idea of learning from nature, following, you know, the way, nature's way, and so on.
Yeah. A really interesting aspect of that to me is how, as we built out the content on AskNature, a lot of times we'll see different biological organisms with different strategies that are ultimately expressing the same underlying you know, just like mathematical or physical principle, like certain, you know, things about, you know, using light and producing color, or certain, you know, physical geometries that are really strong and resilient, like the helicoid structure, where it's like rotating plates, you know, make a really tough structure. And you're like, that's just physics. And biology somehow tapped into that and has put those principles into this manifestation that's really useful to perform this particular function. But there's this underlying thing, that helicoid structure exists, that's just geometry, right? Or you know, the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence, and it's just patterns of numbers. And that's a principle of quantities and ratios and relationships that gets expressed a million different ways through nature. And it's been interesting to see how there is that thing. So it's not just like nature didn't invent these underlying principles. These are the underlying principles of existence as we know it. And then they manifest or are expressed in all of these interesting ways through biological development and evolution. It seems like what we did, or what people did at that moment of saying, wait, we've got the principles, now we don't need nature. We can apply these principles any way we want. And we can, and you can come up with really novel ways of applying those principles, and it gives you something. But when you dismiss the biological use of those principles, you lose all of that R&D, as it's talked about, or as Janine talks about it. And also, Janine is with us here, so Janine, you can comment on all of the ways that we're commenting.
I got out of my appointment, Henry. It's good to see you.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, thank you. That's
yeah, somehow it got canceled. I felt like, you know, when you go to do an exam and there's a thing on the door that says it's canceled. I was so happy.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay.
Yeah. But so I love that, you know, that's that R&D, that 3.8 billion years of evolution, or even the things that did not take the things that evolved at the very beginning, the basic structure of cells, which didn't take a whole long time of development. It happened pretty quickly, right? And it still holds up. It's these things that we see in nature as those same principles that we've wonderfully been able to abstract and learn as pure principles, but then we get to see them applied, and we can learn so much by seeing those applications.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I'm nowhere near enough of a mathematician or a scientist to kind of, you know, comment in detail about that. But one thing it does make me think of, what you were saying, was a question that I had was, okay, so if biomimicry is about, you know, imitating and learning from nature, what do we mean by nature? And is it just biological nature, or is it something else as well? And the answer I came up with is that, and I was inspired by a book by Jay Harmon, The Shark's Paintbrush. So I expect some of you know it. So he came up with this water mixer based on the form of a vortex, right? So he froze a vortex and studied it, its shape and so on, and realized, because there are these thermodynamic principles there, you know, the most efficient way of increasing entropy is through a vortex, right? And entropy is disorganization, and that's what you want when you're mixing paints, for example. You don't want it to be sort of organized into red and yellow paint. You want it all to be mixed together. And he talked about this in a book on biomimicry, right? But vortices are not alive. And, I found this an interesting example, a kind of almost a counter example to the notion of biomimicry. But then you also find the sort of vortical shapes in living beings, which goes along exactly with what you were saying earlier about these general principles, right? The Fibonacci sequence. I'm not an expert on this, but you may well find that in living and non-living in nature, right? And I think what I ultimately decided is that, yes, we can imitate non-living nature, and there may be a few applications, but because there's no evolution, there's no R&D, right? So these are kind of, that there's not the diversity, and they don't form systems, and there are no interests and collaborations. And so, yes, you can imitate non-living nature. There is interesting things going on there, and there is the sort of fundamental physics that everything has to obey. But how much is there to take inspiration from? Probably not a huge amount.
That brings me back to the beginning where you're talking about that kind of social epistemology, where there seems to be like a great increase in the amount of knowledge that you can gain and apply when you are bouncing it off of other beings. And that's so fundamentally what's going on in biology, right? It's still the same matter that is interacting at just a mineral level, right? But now you've put those minerals into these really complicated arrangements that interact with each other and cause really intricate reactions. And that's all kind of information and all new possibilities. If something is just a solid block of something meeting a solid block of something else, there's only so many interactions that can happen. But if this is 8,000 things mixed together, and this is 8,000 things mixed together, when they combine, there's all of these different iterations and possibilities. And so there's just so much more information. It's like each of those little particles becomes a social entity to be trading information. And that's kind of what's happening, where we see that transition from just pure mineral interaction to biological interaction.
Yeah, but the idea of learning from non-biological nature, I think, poses a kind of epistemological problem. So I wrote a paper called Biomimetic Epistemology, and what I argued was that the way that knowledge builds up in nature is through evolution, right? And obviously, when you say things like, plants know how to photosynthesize, you don't mean that they know how to do it in the way that we know how to drive a car, right? There isn't this sort of conscious subject driving it. But I would argue there is sort of knowledge embedded in the plant, right? And we can sort of abstract that knowledge and use it. But then, does it make sense to say that there's knowledge of how to, increase entropy embedded in a vortex? I mean, this is the sort of philosophical debates I'd like to be having with my students, and I don't know how relevant it is for you. But without evolution, can we talk of knowledge? But then, how can we learn from vortices if there's no knowledge in them? And anyway, this is a sort of
Well, that's great. I think that's a sign of a fruitful idea is when you're left with those questions to explore. And I think more and more that's one of the things that we find with biomimicry and its possibilities and its potential and its relevance is that with, at whatever level you're implementing it or whatever level it's being used, or there's always new ways of thinking about it, new levels at which it can be engaged, where you can say, well, this is great on that physical level, but what's actually going on in the materials level? We can make the material more biomimetic. And then when we've made this biomimetic material and it's performing this biomimetic function, well, what's the actual interaction between this element and the wider ecosystem that it's in? And then you can be thinking of it that way. And then what about all of the living organisms interacting with this, and how does that go? And I think that's one of those things that speaks to me as saying, like, biomimicry is a strong idea because it can function and be relevant at all of those scales. I'm wondering how that kind of relates to looking at it as through the philosophical lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It reminds me of a conversation I had with someone when it was with a designer, and they said they started off with the classic examples, trying to work in that way, Velcro, whatever, you know, those sorts of examples. And then they tried to sort of bring in a more, you know, ecosystem perspective, how it all fits together. And now in their current design work, they've just sort of left behind all the sort of, you know, simplistic transfers. I mean, they could be very complicated in terms of the science, right? But in terms of explaining to someone what's going on, it's quite straightforward, right? And now they're only kind of working at that ecosystemic level. I mean, something that I've focused on a lot in my work has been the idea not just of learning from nature how to, you know, to do technology, basically, and technological systems, but also norms. And this is quite controversial, and depending on my audience, I kind of adapt to what I say a little bit. You have to get people on side first. But this idea that we can learn from nature what's right, you know, I find that a really fascinating idea. And it's to be debated, right? It's less obvious. You know, the technology, it goes without saying, these technologies work. We got them from nature. Right, you know, in a sense, there's nothing more to be discussed there. But this idea that we can learn from nature, you know, how we ought to live on the earth. That was the subtitle of my book, right? Learning from nature how to inhabit the earth, not learning from nature how to build a city or, you know, restructure the economy, but how to inhabit the earth, right? And there's also an interesting distinction you can make between morality and ethics. So the etymological origin of ethics is ethos. And there's this Heidegger text where he talks about the etymology of ethos, which is an important word for biomimicry, right? There's that formulation, you know, connect, ethos, and emulate, right? Anyway, so ethos means like inhabiting a place, right? So it's how we live together in a place, whereas ethics is just how we live together. Morality is just how we live together. And if you look at moral philosophy, what you will find is that our moral duties towards one another are always based on some sort of trait that you find in human beings and potentially also other animals, right? Like reason or sentience, and that's what makes morality possible. Whereas this idea of ethos, this idea of it co-inhabiting a place, suggests that morality can be rooted not just in some feature of us, our mind or our reason, or our ability to feel pain or whatever it is, but in the fact that we all live in the same place. And it's quite a simple idea, but again, it's something that moral philosophy's missed, right? Rooting ethics in a shared place.
Yeah. All right, well, I think we're just about ready to start opening this up and really engaging the whole community here in the conversation. So I want to give everybody a minute to get their thoughts together. You can post questions that you have for Henry or comments in the chat function at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a little speech bubble. You can use that chat, or just raise your hand. We can call on you. Also, we're a small enough group that we can just turn on your microphone and shout out if that is the way that you are feeling moved to interact right now. And so, as we kind of bridge over into that part of the conversation, Henry, I want to say or ask you, with years of engaging with this way, what do you feel looking at biomimicry through a philosophical lens has to offer to biomimicry as a movement or to the world? Like, what's the real value that we get by looking at it this way?
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that within biomimicry, people like it, they get excited about it, it's intuitively appealing. I think understanding the philosophy gives a sense of how it connects to Western thought, right? To Western history, to Western thought, and so on. Because it's often depicted as a kind of niche design movement, right? And everything I've tried to do is to say that it's much more than that. It's a philosophy. It is a kind of, I mean, I don't think personally, and other people disagree, that nature can tell us how humans ought to interact and live with one another. Without going into that debate, but I think it can tell us how we should relate to nature, basically. It can point us in the direction of a healthy relationship to nature, which is what environmental philosophy is all about, right? So, yeah.
Great, thanks. Well, I see our first hand up. Janine, welcome. So good to have you here.
Thank you. I have been following you. We have not met, but I look forward to having a long stroll somewhere with you someday in place.
That'd be great. Yeah, really nice.
That would be great. And I want to thank you for your work and for bringing this, for getting this idea that it's much deeper than a design discipline. My background is in the humanities and the sciences. So I have a forest science background, but I also took an English literature degree, and I was the head of the poetry and prose magazine at Rutgers.
All right.
So the idea of, I'm always looking for how biomimicry is landing in the humanities, and what because I think the humanities have everything to tell us about it, because I too see it as, the biggest thing I see is that it changes or reimagines our stance, Western industrial culture's stance towards the rest of the natural world. And that's a relationship. So changing it from domination to one of mentor-student is a really big cultural deal, I think. And I've been, my thesis in university, in my English literature world, was a look at humans' relationship to the rest of the natural world through Western literature, through the canon of Western literature, starting with the Greeks.
Okay, wow.
So you and I really need to mind meld at some point. And I resonate with so much of what you're saying, and I think I think it's really important, the definitional work that you've tried to do and that we've tried to do. So for instance, this idea of, is it with the, are we mimicking biotic or abiotic? We now know so much that so much of what looks like abiotic rocks or whatever is just, it's biogenic, and it has a lot of organisms already in it. So this is it's a gray area, but the definitional work that we've done around saying, well, let's look at biology. I mean, we've been mimicking volcanoes in our manufacturing processes, and that's abiotic. But let's look at biology, and I think you got it right when you talked about the fact that the technical, and Andrew did too, the fact that the technical wonders and long evolutionary use of physics and chemistry and the universals, when it moves to a biological setting, you do have that complex adaptive system, and you have these organisms co-creating and responding appropriately to their habitats. So there's an embodied wisdom that these organisms have that tells us not only, and that's why I love the subtitle of your book, because it tells us how to inhabit a place, this earth, and a particular place where you happen to be. And so our biomimetic practice we look very much in our consultancy, Biomimicry 3.8, we look very much at technical ideas and mimicking those technical ideas, but always in the context of using life's principles, which they're a larger thing that says, okay, now that you have this material, this idea, what material is best to make it out of, how would nature make it, how would nature ship it, how would nature market it, how would nature have it in its ecosystem over its lifetime and beyond, right? So that idea that you take the embodied wisdom, and we use life's principles to do that. But it's something that you wrestle with it in your world, and it helps us in ours. But we also do wrestle with it. The second thing I'd say, and we could talk all day, but with you, the other thing that you solved for me today, a couple of things, but this idea that the history of when it became almost forbidden to look to the natural world for ideas. And when the book came out and I started to give talks about it, there was a huge backlash in some of the engineering community. And they literally, to this day, if I'm in the audience, there's a certain gentleman who will put his first slide says biomimicry with the universal X sign through it.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. And I'm in the front row. So it's like, wow. And what they say is, that they've gone beyond slavish imitation. Have you heard that term, slavish? Slavish?
Slavish copying. Yeah. Yeah.
As if it's, we've gone beyond that now. And we're not just, and so, and also not seeing that we're really doing very much the same thing, which is abstracting design principles. And now we use life's principles, we're not, but it's very strange that there's a few people that feel that they really have to sort of make that dominance over the natural world, that it's almost like it was a stepping stone to our brilliance, but we're not, you know what I mean? It's still there. Do you find it when in your reading, do you find that tension, or do you think living systems thinking is now mainstreamed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good enough knowledge of sort of the average engineer, and how they've changed. I've got a feeling of the past of technology and engineering through reading what the philosophers said about it, though whether that's fully representative, I don't know. I mean, just to react quickly to what you're saying then, slavish imitation. I mean, the question then is, are they assuming that biomimicry is just slavish imitation? Because it clearly isn't. I mean, your principle nature as model, the way you explain it right at the beginning of biomimicry, it's, imitates or takes inspiration from nature, right? So if it's going beyond nature in some way, that's perfectly natural, right? And that belongs to biomimicry. If they're rejecting nature's ways of doing things, right? And, if it's biomimicry with a cross in that sense, not because it's slavish imitation, we don't even want to take inspiration from nature. We're our own source of inspiration. We're creative beings. I haven't encountered that idea amongst contemporary engineers. I haven't encountered this idea that there shouldn't be slavish.
Biomimetics people. They're biomimetics people, but they've made a differentiation with the word biomimicry versus what they do. Which is biomimicry. I don't know. It's not a lot of people, but there's a certain sort of stubborn core.
I've encountered that in Germany. I went to a workshop in Germany, and they call it that, bionic, right? And there's actually a really strong bionics or biomimetics research tradition there. The problem I have with them is that they do kind of reject biomimicry, right? Because it's more design, and they do engineering, because there's this sort of wishy-washy, well, there is the philosophical element. A lot of them are just like, I'm not interested in philosophy. What's that got to do with the question of how to build a wind turbine, or, whatever it is. Right. So there's a kind of general rejection, but then also, they're kind of indifferent to whether what they're doing is sustainable. It's just a technological innovation. It's going to make money. A lot of it was making some kind of, volcanic industrial process more efficient, and so there's not really any ethics behind what they're doing. And so I find it, I found the sort of, I was amazed by some of the negative attitudes towards biomimicry that I encountered. It seems very irrational to me. But
interesting. Well, I think this long history that you brought up helps me understand it. Helps me understand that there are some people that are still in that, let's not give up too much of our human supremacy. Right. And maybe we learn from the technical, and that's that. It's interesting. I've watched it. I've watched that soften a little bit as people understand sustainability is where we need to go. It's fascinating. But what I'm really glad about is that we spent the time that we did, Dana Baumeister and I, in our definitional work of what biomimicry is, what it isn't, what, the ethos part of it. I think that's really, really important. And that's why I salute the struggles with definitional work.
Yeah, because it is a struggle. And, as a philosopher, you're often expected to present things as though this is how it is, right? So I argue for my definition. But as soon as I leave the books and the articles behind and go into the classroom, I kind of say, all this is open to debate. I mean, that's kind of the nature of a philosophy classroom. But, you know, it's an attempt. That's what it is. It's attempts at definitions. And I don't think, I kind of disagree. A lot of people say we all need to have a totally agreed definition of everything before we can work together, because we need to be speaking the same language. And maybe in some contexts, maybe in science and engineering you do, but in the world, we don't need that.
Yeah.
You know, it's not possible for humans to get on with universally agreed definitions of everything. There are terms that are fundamentally contested, and I see that as a sign of something, you know, healthy and living. You know, these contestations of things, it's a mirror of what's going on in the living world, with, you know, all these little struggles for what this means and what that means, and who gets this resource and who gets that resource, and so on.
Yeah.
So I'm quite sort of open to these sort of open discussions.
Yeah, you know, and the funny thing is that I'm not really tied to the word biomimicry versus biomimetics or bionics or anything. I see them as very much of a piece.
Yeah.
Right. And the ethos around biomimetic technologies, I definitely get definitional about, you know, like the ethos of it. You know, are we studying penguins to make torpedoes? That's not something I necessarily want to be involved in, right? So that's where but in terms of like the field, it's just I think the more the merrier.
Yeah.
Turning to the natural world.
Well,
yeah, and it's hard.
That's like, go ahead. I was going to say that gets at something that Henry and I were talking about earlier, kind of in preparing, when we named this the Plato and the Platypus. And we were saying, how does this relate, right? We've got Plato is a human and a platypus is a platypus. We're really just two species here. But Plato was a human 2,500 years ago who looked at the world around himself, thought about it, and then communicated those thoughts in such a way that they've continued to be passed on, you know, in word and in writing, to where now, 2,500 years later, we can still respond to those ideas. This is what humans as a species do. And we always talk about that. Like, one of the wonderful things about biomimicry is that it seems to be humans doing what humans do the best way that they can, looking at what's around them and finding how do we use the skills and adaptations and you know, and abilities that we have to be the best members of this community, to be the most, you know, to contribute the most to the prosperity of ourselves and our neighbors, to create a good situation. And as we talk about these definitions, we realize that, well, that's a key part of it. We sometimes understand something as so true, right? Like, biomimicry seems to make sense. Okay, to communicate that idea, we have to put some words down so that we can talk about it more easily. That helps us to do things at a certain scale. But those are all just these little human inventions of how we can, you know, better use this idea that we've got. And that's kind of like part of our functions and what we bring to the world.
Is there a question, Andrew?
No, that's not really a question there. Let's
there is
a community here.
Their hands up as well.
Yes, Jennifer.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm a new person here, a new person interacting with the biomimicry group in general. And I'm kind of fascinated in the way that nobody's talking about God ever. And I mean, maybe some are, but I haven't heard that. I actually came to biomimicry from a spiritual perspective. I fully believe in God, and I feel that the reason that nature has so many answers for us that we have yet to discover is because nature was created by God. And God, to me, is the ultimate of everything, you know, omnipotent, omniscient, everything. And that is why there's so much to learn. It seems to me like such an obvious connection that I'm kind of baffled at the fact that, you know, we come up with all these ideas and none of them include the creator as the possible source. So I just wanted to put that out there because, gosh, you know, and I could be mistaken about, you know, that that it's not being talked about, but yeah, So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay. I've got a couple of things to say about that. So one is that what you're talking about, that idea was present in the Middle Ages, right? And one of the reasons for that is that all philosophers in the Middle Ages, you know, were theologians, more or less, right? You couldn't be a philosopher and not believe in God and uphold the truth of the Bible. And there was also this Platonic and Aristotelian heritage of this idea of technology as imitating nature. And the human world, art and craft, is imitating nature. So you did get that idea. You got the idea that when we were learning from nature, we were actually learning from God, because God created nature.
Yeah.
So I have a term for that. I call it theomimicry, right? Because you're only really imitating God, right? Because he's the source of all the ideas. And then there was a character in Nicholas of Cusa. He has a character called the Idiot. Right. And in many ways, he's far from an idiot. And he says that when we imitate God, God was the creator. So we shouldn't imitate God's creation. We should imitate the act of creation. And so we should be created beings. And Hans Blumenberg, who I mentioned earlier, sees this as one of the sources of the idea of humans as not imitators of nature, but as created beings. Anyway, I'm just sort of throwing in these little anecdotes because it's interesting. A more general point about that you were saying. So someone I quote right at the beginning of my book, in the preface even, is Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold was a conservationist, but he's also the father of environmental ethics. And because environmental ethics is at the core of environmental philosophy, or has been up till now, he's also the father of environmental philosophy. So he's hugely important. And he said in The Land Ethic that the reason that conservation work hasn't really got off the ground, there aren't enough people doing it, is that philosophy and religion have not yet taken an interest in it. And I suppose what he's saying by that is that hasn't been seen as something deep, right? It's been seen as something, you know, conservation work, yeah, that's just a practical thing for a few farmers to do in their field. We don't need to think deeply about this, right? Whereas we now know that, you know, conserving and preserving nature is of fundamental importance. And so the point I wanted to make is that, I mean, I don't necessarily share all your beliefs, but this idea that philosophy and religion should be thinking about biomimicry, that it's a fertile terrain, that you know, the sort of points you're making should be being discussed is something I do agree with.
I would like to clarify something, if I may. When I say that I thoroughly believe in God, I'm not saying I'm religious. Because I actually do not agree with religions. I have a much different view of things. And I feel that there's all these principles that God wants us to learn that explain so many things in science. I actually have a science background in agricultural education and science. But the primary principle that I believe everything is based on is the principle of love. And that our existence here is for the purpose of learning to love, learning about love, and welcoming love from each other, from our Creator. So when I put that lens on, everything makes sense. It just clarifies all the questions, because I've been the kind of person who's had the big questions my whole life. And about 14 years ago, I came across some information about what I'm talking about, and it's like, oh my goodness, it was like, you know, the light went on, the doors open, and everything started to make sense.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense, Jennifer. And like, if I can jump in, and I'm so grateful to have everyone here. I think it's something that is in the through line of a lot of philosophical systems and beliefs, right? There's been a lot of ideas discussed, not only in Henry's work and in Janine's work, but if you look at not only the Greeks, but like going as millennia and a half later, Baruch Spinoza had this concept called natura naturata, natura naturans, which is the active and passive aspects of God's work through nature. And that is indeed just even in his philosophy. You got the idealists later in Germany. They have these ideas on nature and spirits in nature, which is part of German idealism and Friedrich Schelling. And it's great because I think what Henry's clarifying a lot with his work is trying to understand biomimicry as something that we've done. We just haven't used those terms, but in the clarifying of the grammar, in clarifying these kinds of linguistic games that we use, we can indeed see, oh, we've been doing this all along. Can we just rarefy and clarify them? So I really appreciate you bringing in God as a perspective, because that's been something that philosophy of religion has and also has gotten some really great answers. So I appreciate you bringing that in. I think, Andrew, you wanted to say something.
Oh, yeah, no, we have another question in from the chat that I want to add to, but I'll say one thing that I just saw anchoring this conversation in time. Pope Francis had just passed a week or so ago, and I'd seen a quote that he said where, as we think about solidarity, it's such an important thing. We think about that in terms of our relationship to each other, and it's really important that we remember that each other isn't just humans, and that it's our whole family. This whole family of creation or existence is one thing. We see that, religiously, and we see that scientifically, and that's just one of those deep truths. So it's the kind of thing where it's resonant and relevant, whatever your particular belief systems are. The idea that humans need to relate to and understand our relationship with the rest of existence, as all things do, is just a perennially robust and important area to explore. So yes, I wanted to bring also in Vanessa has a question here in the chat. Vanessa, if you want to unmute and jump right in, you can do that. Otherwise, I can read it for you if you want. Oh, there you are. Great.
I just have a question with regards to your experiences as a professor, and just having these conversations with young people, because I'm an educator as well, and all of what you said resonates with me in the sense that, it comes to me in very intuitive ways through my lived experiences, and just engaging in that way with nature and just being. So I'm wondering, how do you communicate these ideas with young people, considering how disconnected a lot of young people are today with the natural world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but it's hard to answer it in general because it sort of depends on my audience. And almost all of the teaching I've been doing has been with either, a biomimicry master's course, people are already signed up for it and are on board, or environmental philosophy, and then they might not know about biomimicry. And what always happens then when I talk to them about it is they go, oh, wow, there's so much more to this than I realized. That's the standard view. Because the average environmental philosophy, Janine mentioned the humanities, the average, the humanities 20 years ago had zero interest in, well, philosophy was a bit different, but things like English literature had zero interest in, very little interest in, and I guess, Janine, this is, why I'd like to read your thesis and, why you could then go on and do your groundbreaking work in biomimicry, because at the time there was very little in the humanities, looking at nature, the environment, non-humans, all of that, didn't really exist. And now I find that students are quite open to that. I suppose the only group where it might come as a bit of a shock would be if I went in and did a talk at an engineering school in a kind of, non-sustainability environmental setting. I think the average engineering school would not really be teaching even biomimetics as part of a kind of standard undergraduate degree. And then you'd have to do a bit more work kind of getting people on board. But I'm fortunate. I'm always teaching people that are just, on board with the sort of environmental agenda.
We're coming up about to the top of the hour here. I see Dorna has a question here. Dorna, jump on in.
Well, I don't have a question. I have a thought related to Vanessa's comment. And having been an educator for 38 years and, you know, teaching biomimicry for quite a long time, I've been grappling a lot with what you're talking about, Henry, and how we create an ethos of responsibility and you know, connection to our planet. And what I've been finding with the students I've been working with lately, and it's been middle school and high school, was by creating a, you know, by introducing biomimicry as an innovation, first of all, and getting them excited about it, I have then sort of slid in the idea of, you know, thinking like a biomimetic. You know, how do we connect to nature? How do we live within the ethics of caring for our planet, the ecological principles? Some of the students, and I haven't done it in a way to really force the connection, but I'm seeing some of the students start to make a connection to, wow, this is a whole different way of thinking about our planet. And I recently had, I think it was a freshman in college, a group I was working with came and said to me, "You've changed my way of thinking." And so I don't know if this helps you, Vanessa, but it's been an indirect way and a subtle way of just exciting them about biomimicry as, you know, possible future jobs, you know, and innovation, and then bringing in the thinking, the ecological principles, the connection to the planet, the care of the planet, that some students have been able to make the connection. I don't want to force it. I'm sort of putting it out there for them.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Lorna. I'll add another thing, Vanessa, that we've been talking about as we look at, you know, what to do on the Hive, and we're developing, you know, challenges and events and things that people can participate in, and learning classes and whatnot. And one of the things that's been exciting to see is, you know, kind of research, kind of behavioral research on how just making a small introduction of something or just adopting a small habit can really start to expand someone's engagement with or receptivity to ideas and changes of behavior. So like the example that I saw recently was just about exercise. And they said literally 5 minutes of exercise, just standing up and doing squats, just jumping around for a month, increases people's, you know, general well-being, and then also plants the seed for them to engage more in that activity. So when feeling that real disconnect from nature, it can be like a real big leap for someone to start having a deep conversation, think this about the whole nature of existence, right? But you could say, just take a pine cone and bring it inside or put it on your windowsill and watch how it opens or closes depending on the humidity outside. And that's just a little thing. There's pine cones everywhere. Maybe, I don't know where you live. And they could see that. Just finding some little bit of engagement with nature, with other nature, can be that. And as I corrected myself there, other nature, we're always really trying to remind ourselves to think fully and appreciate fully the sense that we are part of nature. We are nature just like everything else. So if you feel disconnected from nature, look in the mirror. Or don't even look in the mirror, look at your hands. Just start watching that for a minute. Just think for a minute about how this is even happening, how it got here, where it's going. You know, there's a lot of those little tricks that we found that help to just start that little twinkle in your eye about feeling closer to nature. I see Gaia has raised their hand. Yep, Gaia, you can go ahead.
There was that microphone problem earlier, wasn't there?
Yes, Gaia, if you'd like to type your comment in the chat, I can read that out. Okay, she's working on that.
Let's hope it's not a really, really long one.
Yeah, let's hope. Yes. Yeah, and I'll start to wrap us up. We're coming to the top of the hour here. It's really been so great to have everyone here, and Henry, to have you engaging in this and to see just all of the ideas and perspectives that people are bringing. So really enjoying this, and great to have these conversations with everyone. Okay, so here says Guy, a bit rambly, but this opens up a new question or problem for me. How do we deal with the fact that learning from nature, biomimicry, as broad covering and underpinning as it is not the mainstream, is not fully fledged in common knowledge, is divided among us? People who think they can rule nature versus those who know they can learn from it, division in human relations. It makes me think of an emotional assimilation of some sort, which might be needed concomitantly with the more theoretical philosophical framework. So the real question there, Henry, is to you there at the end. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It resonates with something you were saying, Andrew, about, looking at your hands, go and looking at a pine cone, something like that. Because, ultimately, why did I care about, the environment and environmental philosophy? Sure, it was because I was reading in the papers about climate change and stuff. But it was also because I grew up in the countryside and just loved, playing in streams and going into the woods. And a philosopher I worked with in Lyon, Jean-Philippe Pierron, he saw the sort of fundamental drive for the environmental movement as something sort of poetic, right? Some sort of early experience of nature, and then and a love for that, and wanting that to go on, really. The thought that those woods and those streams would all be polluted and disappear is, horrendous. But then what do you do with a generation that hasn't grown up with that? I remember, so I once taught a class, it was applied ethics, and there was and one of the things I was talking about this, and I said, so just think of an experience of wild nature that you've had, just as a kind of starter activity, right, to introduce this idea. And I chose someone at random, and the student I chose said, he said, I've never seen any wild nature. And I was like, what? And I said, have you never been for a walk in the woods? And he was like, no. And, this is a, 18-year-old student, and I don't know what he had been doing, but he'd never been for a walk in the woods in his entire life. And I do think it's going to be that much harder to get someone who's never done that, grown up in a flat, wandered around the city, the suburb they live in, watch TV, video games. It's that much harder to get them to care. And so, yes, we need that emotional resonance, but we need it for children. We need it, everyone can do it, right? Everyone would benefit from going out into, where I live, there's trees around the corner. I'll just go around there because it's nice and green, Everyone's going to benefit from that. But it's a bit harder when you're starting with people who haven't had that from childhood, been dumped in front of an iPad from, a young age.
Yeah. And half of the human population is now urban, right?
Yeah.
I see a new question from Lorenzo. Lorenzo, why don't you go ahead?
Hey, I think there was Janine before.
Oh.
Go ahead, Lorenzo, because I already had a shot. You can please go, please.
Well, my comment, and also in kind of not answering what Guy is saying, but we're really lacking. We're really disconnected from nature, as Henry was saying, and bringing nature back and using maybe biomimicry to stimulate curiosity in people is what is, to me, necessary, because it's also on a view of the sustainability. But at the same time, no one really understands why they need to do it, because it's just some regulations or you need to abide certain rules. But if you bring nature back into people and they really understand that we're part of it, they will be sustainable by themselves without the need for abiding certain rules. So I think it's bringing nature back into people's whatever means we have.
Yeah, if I can just comment on that, I think that the environmental movement is in some ways struggling at the moment, right? That it kind of during COVID, it felt like new things were happening, new possibilities emerging, people were getting on board. And then the last few years, the political consensus around net zero in the UK, for example, is sort of shattered, right? And we've got a populist right-wing movement that is, anti the climate, basically, and similar things going on in the States and so on. And I think part of the mistake that the kind of big international discourses around the environment have made is, just to really sort of, some people would disagree, but they haven't thought about the fundamental caring for and motivation, for doing these things. It's not really connecting. It's regulations. It's all this sort of, techno discourse. I'm not expressing myself very clearly, but, there's a kind of economic and political discourse that's kind of lives in its own world, a bit disconnected from nature.
Great, thank you. And Claire, I see you have a question. Why don't you go ahead?
More of a comment, thank you. I've spent a lot of time in nature. I've had the benefit of a lot of exposure and a lot of opportunities to learn. But I hit a real bump with environmental movements and finding a way to not feel so sad all the time, even on a walk. Like, what is this going to look like in 20 years? The tree is estimated it won't live in this climate zone. And, that kind of thing invaded my reverence. And so one of the first things I learned about biomimicry from an interview with Zita Anakani and Krista Tippett and Janine Benyus, I think, was in the audience. And so there was a reference, and then I started following Janine Benyus. And my point is about the charnel lands and that piece of it where, and I'm getting choked up, where the capacity for nature to heal even after being decimated just really was a big hook for me. So I just wanted to give a shout out for that, that wrote in to biomimicry, even though there's much more than that. That was really a big hook for me. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Claire. All right, I think here we have more. Oh, Dorna, you're back. Go ahead.
There was a question in the chat as well.
We had something there. Oh, something else in chat. Oh yeah, okay. Dorna, go ahead, and then I'll get Gaia's follow-up in chat.
My mistake. I didn't mean to hit the hands up.
Okay, no problem. Then I'll jump here to Gaia, and I think Janine had a question too, and that looks like that's everyone. Let's see, Gaia. Do you think biomimetic art, whatever that would really look like, could have an important place in a biomimetic revolution? I'll say something, actually, if I can quickly here. Camila was actually at a San Francisco Climate Week event about the role of art in conservation in general. And I know one of the things that we talked about was something that we talked about a lot on AskNature, which is that we found that the artistry of it, both visually, through the size of the pictures, the quality, the writing, is all a critical point, critical element to making that connection and that emotional connection between the reader and the organism that they're learning from and nature more broadly, where you can just have a list of facts about nature, and that could be in a spreadsheet, and you could just pick them and go off on your way. But that would give you some knowledge, but it wouldn't give you very deep knowledge, and it wouldn't do the critical piece of that reconnection, which we think is so important about biomimicry. And so it's really the artistry of AskNature that allows us to do that, and to ensure that as you're getting this knowledge, you're also getting this relationship, and you're also kind of engaging with that part of the human understanding. So that's my bit to add there. And Henry, up to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's one that I kind of had in the background for years and never really addressed, and now I kind of have addressed it, and I've been thinking about it quite a bit these last few years, and I published an article on biomimicry and aesthetics, where I talked about ecological art and biomimicry, and that's come out really recently. And I mean, one interesting way of looking at this is parallel to the history of technology I was talking about earlier. The history of art followed a very similar path. So at basically the same time that Dessau was saying we should stop imitating nature, we should just come up with our own inventions. Artists were saying a similar thing. There was this rejection of the idea, because in the world of arts, the idea that art should imitate nature, or that art does imitate nature, was seen as the idea that art represents nature, right? Pictures of trees or human beings or whatever, right? Art represents nature. And that idea was rejected by Hegel, as I said earlier. And the kind of that rejection sort of peaked. I mean, if you look at the history of art, you move from representational art, and then you get impressionism, so it's no longer the thing, it's my impression of the thing. And then you get expressionism and surrealism and conceptual art. And the kind of common ground is this the sort of collapse of this old idea that art imitates nature in the sense of representing nature. The best example of this that I know of is Piet Mondrian. So he's the guy who does those grid. There's black lines in a grid, and then you have red, yellow, white, and blue. And he wrote a book about, talking about what he was doing. And he said that what he was trying to do was to sort of represent the abstract human mind, which he saw as the antithesis of nature. And that's why there's no green, there's nothing recognizable, and there are no curves, right? It's all straight lines, grids, and so on. And I think that now, just as, if you take that parallel history of, art and technology in the sort of modernist era, and then you think, well, hold on, designers and engineers are now interested in imitating nature. Artists, taking inspiration from nature, this is going on. I mean, I don't know if that makes it biomimetic art, if we need that label, but a lot of I talked about ecological art in my article, a couple of examples and so on, which I saw as not just instances of biomimicry, but as shedding light on, because this is something that art can do, shedding light on these deeper questions about how we relate to nature, bringing in the senses, right? Bringing in emotions, it's not just the sort of the engineering perspective, but also doing so in a way that's more kind of questioning and ambiguous and makes us think. So it's not a question of doing just biomimetic art. It's through art asking the kind of questions that we ought to be asking about our relationship to nature.
Great. Okay, Janine. Welcome back.
This is so rich. I love this. I'm wondering, I love how you're mapping us, where we are, where we've been in our relationship to the rest of the natural world, and how culture definitely plays a part in that, has its finger on the scale for sure, in so many ways. So if we have been on this long, not long in archaeological terms, but long in modern terms, history terms, if we've been on this long journey away from looking to the natural world, and now I see a little blip, I hope it's a blip, of, anything environmental is woke and we need to get away from that, and it's nonsense, and this whole, denigrating the body and elevating the mind, so to speak, or, elevating the technological endeavor. We have a blip there, definitely, that is, again, rejecting a lot of things, the body, in many ways, women and earth and anybody who cares about the earth, What role can philosophy play in bringing us back to being curious about nature's norms, as a way of counteracting the false narrative that does sometimes use science to justify its behavior at the moment, right? How does philosophy, how could philosophy help turn us back towards the natural world in a trusting way? Not just for inventions, but in this embodied way of living in place. What has there been a historic moment when philosophy went viral about a certain thing that you can point to? Do you think we are in a moment like that? And if not, how do we get there?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a couple of aspects to it I'd like to address. So a sort of the first one is my kind of cop-out one. It's probably not a direct answer. Because one thing I think that philosophy can do, and it relates to what you were saying about how biomimicry lands in the humanities, is start building these connections. I've been talking about Aldo Leopold, the history of Western thought. I mean, everything you were just saying then showed me or reminded me of how close biomimicry could be to ecofeminism, right? So there are kind of existing philosophical movements out there. And I think we can start joining up the dots, because as it is, again, as I was saying, biomimicry, it's not, I don't know why, and it's hard to pinpoint it, but how it lands in the humanities, I always feel often it hasn't really landed in the humanities and that it ought to. I mean, maybe you've got a different take, but I feel that there could be, far more discussion. So one thing I try and do as a philosopher is just join the dots between different branches of philosophy, different more theoretical parts of the humanities, discussions about post-humanism in English literature and agency, and this idea that, it's not just humans that are agents, but then going, well, hold on, can nature not be an epistemic agent? So connecting all the dots and getting people to be interested in biomimicry is one side of it. The other side of it, and this is perhaps a deeper answer, is that, what I've really tried to do, because that's not what my book's about really, is to try and present, I kind of don't like the word, but something like a worldview, right? An idea of what it would mean to inhabit the earth in its most fundamental ways, and then hope that people could read that and sort of agree with it, basically. This worldview, just as Marx presented a worldview, the Communist Manifesto. A colleague of mine in France is writing a kind of biomimicry manifesto. So he works at the CBIOS. It's almost like the French Biomimicry Institute, and he's convinced that the shift we need is cultural. A manifesto for this. But yeah, I think ultimately you need to present it as something attractive. I think the danger with philosophy is that if you don't, my work, for example, if you're not philosophically inclined, you're going to struggle with it. I think, it's not supposed to be a bestseller. But we've all got our limitations, and mine is that my books are going to sell a few hundred copies.
That's okay. Because you're in your discipline, you're holding up that that island of thought and I fully agree with you that we need to join this island of thought, with the other islands of thought. Join it and say, this is related. This is very much related. There's a reason indigenous voices are rising now at this moment, right? It's related. Biomimicry is related to that, right? And so I would say, thank you for holding that up in the spheres that you are, that your ripple of impact goes out from. It's fine that you're just doing it that way. Philosophy,
but within philosophy, things go viral. I wrote an article and I published it in Philosophy of Science, which is a really, really high-ranking philosophy journal. And I was kind of thinking, wow, maybe a load of people will latch onto this because it's in a good journal. There wasn't really, the articles that previously been published have been published in more specialist environmental philosophy of technology journals. So Philosophy of Science, it's the big Philosophy of Science journal. So I was thinking, oh, maybe that will get it. But, you know, I think a lot of people see the title, biomimetics, what's that? You know, I work on normal epistemology, don't even know what that is, won't read it, you know. And you can't, you can't make things go viral. All you can do is your best. And hopefully, I mean, you can try and think about your audience, but if it was that easy to go viral, you know, I mean, anyone sort of posting stuff on the internet is probably hoping that it will get picked up on and become a big deal. Anyone writing a book is hopeful that people will read it and start sharing the ideas or recommending it to their friends. And just got to keep going, I guess. I mean, you never know when things will take off. I mean, your book went viral essentially, didn't it? I mean,
it did. It did. I mean, this idea has gone viral for sure, and it was ripe for the moment was ripe for it, and there was definitely a super saturated solution, I think, of people. You know, it was right on the tip of people's tongues. Like, isn't there a sustainable world already? Why are we trying to invent one? Right? Yeah. People got that, but it took, I don't know. You know, I would be a crystal ball reader if I could understand how some things go the way this went.
Can I ask you a question, Janine? Because Andrew mentioned one time that you're writing another book. Am I even allowed to mention that or bring it up? Could you say anything about that, or is it a closely guarded secret?
No, it's not at all. I'm writing a book about nature's universals in 7 different areas. These are things that most organisms have in common, and I'm looking at them from all scales, from the micro scale all the way up to biospheric. So the realms, I hope, will be useful for biomimics, right? So it's questions again, like my last book, but this is, you know, this is a biology book. So it's how does nature heal, from cutting your finger to a volcano blows up, and how does Mount St. Helens come back, right? So how does nature grow and right size?
Okay,
hopefully that'll be useful for economics. You know, how does nature self-organize for collective action? Right?
Wow.
Looking at everything from herds to molecules to anyway, there's 7 realms of human endeavor that I'm trying to bring the biology forth, because my sense is that we're behind on our understanding of how life really works. You know, you mentioned the complex adaptive systems, and a lot of us are still in Newtonian thought processes, right, and machine models, and it's time to update our understanding of how life really works, and we're a part of that, and what our true nature is. So I'm hoping to basically, you know, do the biology reading that people don't have, you know, the ability, the time or the wherewithal to do, right?
Brilliant.
So
that'd be so useful.
The biological literature.
Because I was saying to, you know, Andrew asked a question about these, you know, universal principles and so on, and I said I am nowhere near enough of a mathematician or a scientist to say much about that, but hopefully your book will plug the gap, right? I won't need to be that. You could have done it for
I hope so. I hope it'll be useful.
Yeah, I think so.
And one more thing that you mentioned that I do think is very useful is that you mentioned this idea of putting out a worldview that people can, like, what would a nature informed world look like? And that's, I think of that in a complex adaptive system when it's trying to move through the adaptive cycle, and, you know, like a forest is trying to move from a forest fire to reorganize. There are these strange attractors that sort of a coral reef will go back to a coral reef, a forest will go back to a forest. There are strange attractors that sort of limit the realm of possibilities, and things go into, right, they go back into that forest. So I've been reading people talking about the fact that even, they call them visuals, but they're sort of, if somebody could paint a picture of what a really healthy food system would look like, perhaps we as a culture could agree on that. And and so I'm wondering if there is a manifesto, a strange attractor that would, you know, so people would see this as more than Velcro, but as,
Yeah, I mean,
as sort of a new era.
Yeah, the first project I worked on was actually on biomimetic cities. And what interested me in that wasn't so much the sort of details. I mean, I was working with engineers and biologists, but was this idea of picturing a sort of about as fully fledged a world as you could get, right? But then I kind of realized that, okay, it's one thing to have kind of an idea, right? What it might be like to wander around this city, what the buildings would look like, how they'd work and so on. But that's just the kind of the physical environment. And then we also need to put in, all the ethics and the norms and so on. And, another fascinating question would be, in that bio-informed world, what would, the economy look like? And I don't just mean, a circular economy. I mean, finance, global trade. What would the political systems look like? Should we even be trying to develop biologically informed political systems, or is there a limit? I mean, these are huge questions.
Yeah.
The closest I've got to exploring them. So really for my own fun, I wrote a novel that was set in the bio-inspired future. I haven't found a publisher yet, and I haven't got around to publishing it myself, but that was the only place where I felt that I could explore the kind of what would it be like to live in that world, with characters.
Do you have that novel, Henry? Is it written?
Yeah, I do.
Gosh.
I do. Yeah, I mean, I don't. My parents liked it. My mum and dad.
It looks like you can get a pretty good blurb on the cover now. So
yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
I would love to see. I bet there's funders that would fund this sort of a thing. We recently went for a Rasmussen grant, which was a European funder, and they were interested in nature-centric governance models. But I wonder if we could get a funder that would entertain a sort of a collab or a conclave of people. You would definitely be there, Henry, who would begin to imagine a nature-informed world in all these realms. And I don't know what's the outcome of that. You don't want another talk fest. Yeah. But
there's also there's a danger as well, though, that you get a load of people and they would come up with their vision, whereas perhaps it's not about all agreeing on the specificities of a vision. Maybe we could only agree on the very sort of broadest principles, precisely because it's not for me or for you or for a group of people to tell everyone else what the future is exactly going to be like, right? I mean, if there are principles of openness and democracy and discussion and debating definitions, and it's not as easy as picturing some sort of utopia and saying let's all go and live there. I mean, that probably wouldn't work out that well. But I mean, it's
I
a fascinating thing to...
I don't know. It's because I do think Ecolopolis was a novel that came out that was influential at a certain time in environmental circles, right? But I wish Henry Dick's novel would come out. We could all talk about it at least and say there's an attractor. I think it's part of the role of culture, actually.
There was the question earlier about biomimetic art.
Yeah,
that could really be part of it. Yeah.
Fascinating.
I think it's more about the whole world engaging in that conversation than the whole world agreeing on exactly how everything ought to be, because that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, we started that conversation, at least, or moved that conversation along a lot today. I want to thank everybody for joining here and for sticking around for some extra time with Henry, with Janine, with the whole community. This is really what we love to do with the AskNature Hive, really bring these people and ideas into the community and just see what kind of ideas can flow and what new inspiration everyone will gain from it. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Henry, for all of the work that you've been doing for years and for joining us here today. We look forward to more, and everyone keep sharing your ideas here on the Hive. There's all the ways that you can post in the different circles on the side there, and you can reach out to each other also through direct messaging on here. And I'll give you a little toss that next month in June, we'll be going on the very practical side. So we've been very heady today. We'll be very practical. We're meeting with Deepak Rajmohan from Green Pod Labs, which is a phenomenally successful biomimetic organization, and Ray of Hope alum. We'll get to hear how they've been working and the things that they've been doing. Really, he thinks as highly as he acts on it, and it'll be a great conversation. And hope you can all join us again next month and keep talking on the Hive. Thanks again, Henry, and everyone for being here.
Okay, thank you.
Many thanks.
Bye, everyone. Have a nice